The pilots stopped talking. Every system was dying. 267 passengers had no idea they were about to crash into the ocean, until a quiet woman in seat 23A stood up and walked to the cockpit with 7 words that changed everything: "I'm landing this plane. Trust me completely." Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning light filtered through the massive glass walls of Heathrow's Terminal 3, casting long shadows across Gate 47 where American Airlines Flight 209 sat waiting at the jetway. The Boeing 787-9 Dreamliner gleamed white and silver under the artificial lights, its swept wings and elegant fuselage representing the pinnacle of modern aviation engineering. Inside the terminal, the usual choreographed chaos of international departure played out as it had thousands of times before: families saying goodbye, business travelers scrolling through phones, tourists adjusting overstuffed carry-ons. Sarah Brennan stood in the boarding queue with her ticket in hand, dressed in dark jeans and a simple gray sweater that made her look like any other passenger heading across the Atlantic. At 44, she'd perfected the art of blending in during the 2 years since retirement, deliberately avoiding anything that might invite questions about her past. Her posture was too straight, her awareness too sharp, but most people didn't notice. They saw a woman of average height with shoulder-length brown hair touched with gray, practical flats, and the weary expression of someone facing a long flight. They didn't see Commander Sarah "Hawk" Brennan, former U.S. Navy F/A-18 Super Hornet pilot with 16 years of carrier aviation experience and over 200 carrier landings, some of the most demanding and precise flying humans ever performed. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, received the practiced smile and "have a nice flight," and walked down the jetway toward the aircraft. The familiar smell of jet fuel and recycled air triggered memories she'd been trying to suppress for 2 years: the catapult shot off a carrier deck, the controlled violence of trapping a wire at night in heavy seas, the constant edge of danger that defined naval aviation. She pushed the thoughts away as she entered the 787's cabin, where flight attendants greeted passengers with professional warmth. "Welcome aboard," a young flight attendant said brightly. "Seat 23A. Down on your left, window seat." Sarah nodded and made her way down the aisle, sliding into the window seat of row 23. The economy cabin stretched behind her, already filling with the 248 passengers who would join the 19 crew members for this routine transatlantic crossing. The couple in 23B and 23C, early 20s, holding hands, absorbed in their phones, barely acknowledged her. The businessman across the aisle in 23D had already donned noise-canceling headphones and closed his eyes. Perfect. Anonymity was what she wanted, what she needed. She settled in and deliberately avoided looking out the window at the tarmac and the distant taxiways where aircraft moved in their eternal dance. 2 years ago she told herself she was done with aviation, done with the sky, done with the identity that had defined her entire adult life since the Naval Academy. 2 years ago she'd been carried off the USS Theodore Roosevelt on a stretcher, her body broken, her mind shattered by the images she couldn't unsee: the fireball when her F/A-18 hit the carrier deck at the wrong angle, the twisted metal, the rescue crews working frantically to cut through the wreckage, and Lieutenant Marcus Chen, her radar intercept officer, her best friend, dead in the back seat while she'd survived with major injuries and the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. The landing signal officer had called the ball at the wrong moment. The deck had been pitching in heavy seas. The approach had been compromised from the start. But none of that changed the fact that she'd been in command, she'd been flying, and Marcus had died while she'd lived. 8 months of physical rehabilitation had healed her body, the shattered pelvis, the crushed vertebrae, the internal injuries. But no amount of therapy had healed the part of her that couldn't face going back to the deck, couldn't imagine climbing into another Super Hornet, couldn't bear the thought of looking at another Rio and knowing she might bring them home in a body bag. So she'd retired. Commander Sarah Brennan, one of the few women to command a carrier-based fighter squadron, an officer known throughout the fleet as one of the most skilled carrier pilots in naval aviation, had walked away from the only life she'd ever wanted. Her call sign, Hawk, had represented her legendary precision during carrier approaches, the ability to land on a moving ship in darkness or storm with accuracy that only the best naval aviators ever achieved. Now it represented nothing. She was just Sarah, civilian, trying to figure out who she was without the Navy, without the wings, without the identity that had meant everything. A flight attendant stopped at her row. "Would you care for anything to drink before departure?" "Coffee, please." "Black." "Of course." Sarah accepted the small cup with a polite smile and cradled it in her hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. Around her, the cabin filled with the ambient noise of modern air travel, overhead bins slamming shut, the murmur of conversations, the electronic chimes of seatbelt signs illuminating. She pulled a paperback novel from her bag and opened it to a marked page, though she'd been stuck on the same chapter for 3 days. Reading had become difficult since the crash. Concentration fractured easily. But it gave her something to do with her hands, something to look at that wasn't the sky. In the cockpit of Flight 209, Captain David Mitchell completed the pre-flight checklist with the practiced efficiency of 22 years flying for American Airlines. At 49, with gray touching his temples and the slight paunch of too many hotel meals, he'd settled into the comfortable routine of senior captain on international routes. His background as an Air Force transport pilot had prepared him well for commercial aviation, the discipline, the procedures, the understanding that airline flying was about consistency and safety rather than pushing performance envelopes. "Fuel load confirmed," he said, checking the display. 42,600 kilograms. "That'll give us plenty of reserve for the crossing." First Officer Rachel Torres nodded, her fingers moving across the flight management computer. At 33, she was working toward her captain upgrade, accumulating the hours and experience that would eventually earn her the left seat. She'd joined American 8 years ago after flight school and regional airline time, and she loved the technical precision of modern airliners. Flight plan loaded. NAT track Alpha, flight level 410, Mach .85. 7 hours 35 minutes to Boston. Perfect. Mitchell keyed the radio. Heathrow ground, American 209 at gate 47, request pushback in taxi. American 209, Heathrow ground, pushback approved, taxi via Alpha 6, Bravo 9 to runway 27 right. Alpha 6, Bravo 9 to 27 right, American 209. The coordination continued with the familiar rhythm of airline operations, the ground crew disconnecting the jetway, the pushback tug easing the massive 787 away from the gate, the engines spooling up with their characteristic whine. Mitchell and Torres worked through checklists, their communication abbreviated by experience. This was their third Atlantic crossing together this month. They knew each other's habits, trusted each other's competence, and approached the flight with the mundane professionalism of skilled pilots managing a routine operation. American 209, contact tower on 118.5. 118.5, American 209. Heathrow Tower, American 209, ready for departure runway 27 right. American 209, Heathrow Tower, winds 270 at 12, runway 27 right, cleared for takeoff. Mitchell advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling the twin engines surge to full power. The 787 accelerated down the runway, the composite airframe transmitting only minimal vibration to the cockpit. At 157 knots he called, "Rotate," and Torres pulled back on the side stick. The Dreamliner lifted gracefully into the gray British morning, climbing through broken clouds toward cruising altitude. "Gear up," Mitchell commanded. "Gear up," Torres confirmed, watching the indicators. American 209, contact departure on 119.72. 119.72, American 209. Good day. The flight progressed through its standard departure profile, climbing to initial altitude, turning toward the first waypoint, establishing communication with London Control. Within 20 minutes they'd left British airspace and were heading out over the Atlantic Ocean on North Atlantic Track Alpha, one of the organized track system routes that moved hundreds of aircraft safely across the ocean every day. At 41,000 feet, the sky above was brilliant blue, the ocean below a gray-green expanse stretching to every horizon. "Autopilot engaged," Torres said. "Systems all green. Good. We'll have lunch in about an hour. Should be a smooth crossing, weather looks clear all the way to Boston." Neither pilot could have known they'd just spoken their last relaxed words of the flight. In seat 23A, Sarah had given up pretending to read. She stared at the novel's page without seeing the words, her mind drifting despite her efforts to anchor it in the present. The young couple beside her had fallen asleep against each other. The businessman across the aisle snored softly. Around her, passengers had settled into the typical patterns of a long flight, some watching movies on seatback screens, others reading, a few already asleep despite it being midday. She deliberately avoided looking at the flight progress map on her own screen. Watching the little airplane icon crawl across the Atlantic triggered too many memories, the endless hours of overwater flying during carrier deployments, the strange isolation of being suspended over featureless ocean with nothing but instruments and trust in her aircraft. She'd once loved that feeling, the pure essence of flight stripped of ground references, nothing but sky and sea and the machine responding to her inputs. Now it just reminded her of everything she'd lost. A flight attendant moved down the aisle with the beverage cart. "Anything to drink?" "Water, please." Sarah accepted the plastic cup and sipped slowly, trying to focus on the sensation, the coolness, the simple reality of being a passenger on a commercial flight rather than a naval aviator responsible for a $50 million fighter and the life of the person in the back seat. She'd been seeing a therapist for 18 months now, every Wednesday at 3 in the afternoon, sitting in a comfortable office in Baltimore trying to process trauma and grief and the fundamental question of identity after losing the thing that had defined her for 16 years. "You need to forgive yourself," the therapist had said in their last session. "Marcus's death wasn't your fault. The investigation concluded that the LSO made an error, that the deck conditions were marginal, that multiple factors contributed to the crash." "I was in command," Sarah had replied, the same answer she always gave. "I was flying. He was my responsibility. And you did everything right. You fought to control that aircraft even after the nose gear collapsed. You took the impact that should have killed both of you. The only reason you survived is because you're an exceptional pilot who maintained control under impossible circumstances. Maybe. But exceptional pilots were supposed to bring their crews home alive. Exceptional pilots with call signs like Hawk were supposed to be precise enough, skilled enough, aware enough to prevent crashes. Except she hadn't prevented it. She'd lived while Marcus had died, and no amount of rationalization changed that fundamental fact. The 787's engines hummed with their characteristic quiet efficiency. Modern turbofans were incredibly reliable, encased in computer systems that monitored every parameter and adjusted performance thousands of times per second. The entire aircraft was a masterpiece of engineering redundancy, backup systems for backup systems, fail-safes built upon fail-safes, every critical function duplicated or triplicate to ensure safety. Commercial aviation had become so safe that accidents were statistical anomalies, tragic aberrations rather than regular occurrences. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing it wouldn't come. Sleep had been difficult since the crash, fragmented, interrupted by nightmares, never restful. She'd wake up seeing the deck rushing at her, feeling the impact, hearing Marcus's cut-off scream in the back seat. The therapist had prescribed medication. It helped some nights. Not others. She was drifting in that uncomfortable space between wakefulness and sleep when something changed. It wasn't a sound exactly, more the absence of sound, or the quality of sound. The background hum of the aircraft had shifted imperceptibly, a change most passengers would never notice but that registered immediately in her combat-trained awareness. She opened her eyes and listened intently. There. Again. A slight change in engine tone, barely perceptible. Not dangerous, probably just a minor throttle adjustment by the autopilot. But her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. She'd spent 16 years training those instincts, learning to read aircraft behavior through tiny sensory cues that preceded instrument indications. Naval aviators developed a sixth sense for their aircraft. They felt problems before computers registered them. Sarah told herself she was being paranoid, that her trauma was making her hypervigilant about normal operations. This was a commercial flight on a modern airliner, not a carrier operation where everything happened at the edge of performance envelopes. She needed to relax, to stop interpreting every sensation through combat training she no longer needed. But then she heard voices from the cockpit, muffled but carrying a tone she recognized instantly. Not alarm yet, but confusion and concern. The particular quality that pilots used when something unexpected was happening and they were trying to diagnose it. She shifted in her seat, angling herself toward the front of the cabin. Row 23 put her far enough back that she shouldn't be able to hear cockpit conversations, but commercial cockpit doors weren't as soundproof as people assumed. And her hearing had been trained to filter signal from noise, to pick out critical communications during the chaos of carrier operations. All showing failure. A woman's voice, the first officer. Primary, backup, SATCOM. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Communications failures. Multiple systems simultaneously. That shouldn't be possible on a 787. The Dreamliner had redundant communication systems specifically designed so total failure couldn't occur. The businessman across the aisle in 23D snored on, oblivious. The young couple remained asleep against each other. Flight attendants moved normally through the cabin. But Sarah's combat instincts were fully engaged now, parsing every sound, every sensation, building a threat picture from incomplete information. Another voice from the cockpit, deeper, male, probably the captain, GPS signal lost, inertial reference showing errors. Navigation failures now. Following communication failures. Sarah's mind raced through failure scenarios. She knew the 787 systems, she'd studied them during her transition training when the Navy had briefly considered Super Hornets with similar fly-by-wire architectures. This pattern didn't match any normal failure mode. Redundant systems didn't fail simultaneously without a catastrophic cause. Then she felt it, a tiny hesitation in the aircraft's movement, a momentary lag in response. The autopilot had disconnected. She knew that feeling from her own aircraft, the subtle change when automated systems handed control back to human pilots. The 787 was now being hand-flown. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt slowly, trying not to alarm nearby passengers. She needed to get closer to the cockpit, needed to hear what was happening. This was wrong, not just unusual but fundamentally wrong in ways that her training recognized even if she couldn't yet articulate why. She stood and moved forward up the aisle, walking with the casual purpose of someone heading to the lavatory. A flight attendant in the forward galley smiled at her. "Restrooms available on your left." "Thank you," Sarah said, but she didn't turn toward the lavatory. She positioned herself near a seat where she could hear the cockpit more clearly, pretending to adjust her sweater while her ears strained to pick up conversation beyond the door. Flight management computers freezing, autopilot disconnect. Weather radar offline, collision avoidance system dead. Sarah's blood went cold. Cascading system failures. Multiple redundant systems dying simultaneously. This wasn't random failure, this was systematic destruction of aircraft systems in a specific sequence. She'd seen similar patterns in classified briefings about cyber attacks on military aircraft, theoretical scenarios where hostile actors could compromise fly-by-wire systems through malicious code or electromagnetic attack. The captain's voice again, strained now, hand flying but controls are feeling wrong, delays in response. Flight control degradation. That was the nightmare scenario for fly-by-wire aircraft. The 787 had no mechanical backup controls, no cables running from cockpit to flight surfaces. Every input went through computers. If those computers failed completely, the aircraft became a 250-ton glider with no way to control it. Sarah moved closer to the cockpit door, her military bearing unconsciously asserting itself. The senior flight attendant noticed her approach and stepped into her path. "Ma'am, this area is for crew only. If you need something, I need to speak with the pilots." Sarah's voice carried command authority she hadn't used in 2 years. "I'm a naval aviator. They're experiencing fly-by-wire degradation." The flight attendant's expression shifted from polite to concerned. "Ma'am, I'm sure the pilots have everything under control. Please return to your seat. Listen to me." Sarah locked eyes with her, using the intensity that had once commanded fighter squadron briefings. "I'm Commander Sarah Brennan, U.S. Navy retired. I flew F/A-18 Super Hornets for 16 years. I know what fly-by-wire failure sounds like, and I can hear it through that door. In about 5 minutes, those pilots are going to lose control authority completely. We're over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. If that happens, everyone on this aircraft dies. Let me through." The flight attendant stared at her, seeing something in Sarah's eyes that cut through protocol and procedure, absolute certainty born of experience, the command presence of an officer who'd made life-and-death decisions at supersonic speeds. After a 3-second evaluation that felt like an eternity, she reached for the cockpit door keypad. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said quietly, entering the code. The door opened and Sarah stepped into the cockpit to find both pilots fighting with unresponsive controls while warning messages flooded their displays. Captain David Mitchell looked up from the control stick with surprise that instantly shifted to frustration. "This is a restricted area. Get back to your seat immediately." Sarah ignored him, her eyes scanning the displays and instrument panels with the trained assessment of a combat pilot reading a threat picture. Primary flight displays showing intermittent data. Navigation displays dark. Warning messages cascading faster than the pilots could acknowledge them. Flight control stick moving with the jerky, delayed response that indicated degraded fly-by-wire authority. She'd seen this before in simulator training, the progressive death spiral of computer-controlled flight systems. "Captain, I'm Commander Sarah Brennan, retired U.S. Navy, former F/A-18 Squadron Commander with 16 years of carrier aviation experience." Her voice cut through his anger with absolute authority. "Your aircraft is experiencing progressive flight control computer failure. In approximately 4 to 6 minutes you'll lose complete control authority and this aircraft will be unflyable. I can help you if you listen right now." Mitchell stared at her, his face flushed with stress and adrenaline. "This is completely inappropriate. You're experiencing multiple node failures in your flight control computers," Sarah continued, stepping closer to stand behind the pilot's seats. "Your fly-by-wire system is degrading from normal law toward direct law or potentially complete failure. You need to transfer to alternate control law immediately and prepare for manual reversion procedures. I've flown aircraft through fly-by-wire failures. I know how to handle this." First Officer Torres twisted in her seat, her young face pale with fear. "Captain, we're losing it. Nothing we're trying is working. We've lost all communications, navigation is dead, flight management system is frozen, and the controls feel like they're going to stop responding completely any second." Mitchell's eyes flickered between Sarah and his instruments. Every instinct trained by decades of commercial aviation told him to remove this passenger from his cockpit and handle the emergency by procedure and experience. But procedure wasn't working. Experience was failing him. They were hand-flying a crippled 787 over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with 267 people aboard and no backup plan that didn't end in controlled flight into ocean. "What do you suggest?" he asked, the words tasting like defeat. Sarah moved to stand directly between the two pilots where she could see all displays. "Transfer to alternate control law right now, that bypasses your failed primary computers and gives you more direct access to actuators. Reduce your speed to minimum safe, you'll need maximum control authority and lower speed gives you better response. Start descending immediately to 25,000 feet. Lower altitude means better air density, which improves control effectiveness. And prepare yourselves for the possibility that you're going to lose fly-by-wire completely and need to coordinate manual flight using nothing but raw pitch input and power management. Torres looked at Mitchell. Sir. He took 3 seconds to make the decision, then nodded. Do it. Alternate law, speed reduction, descent clearance to flight level 250. Torres's hands moved across the mode control panel. Transferring to alternate law now. Speed bug set for 250 knots. Initiating descent. She paused, looking at the dark communication panels. We can't get descent clearance. All radios are dead. Squawk 7700, Sarah said immediately. Emergency transponder code. Shanwick Oceanic Control will see it and clear the airspace around you even without radio contact. Mitchell reached for the transponder. 7700 set. We're declaring emergency. The aircraft's descent began, a controlled reduction in altitude that felt almost normal except for the wrong feel of the controls, the delayed response to inputs, the sense that the 787 was only barely obeying commands. Sarah watched the flight control displays, seeing the diagnostic messages that confirmed her analysis. Multiple processor failures. Bus errors. Communication delays between systems. This aircraft's electronic brain was dying. What exactly is happening to our aircraft? Mitchell asked, still hand-flying while Torres worked through emergency checklists. Systematic destruction of your avionics systems, Sarah said. Communications went first, then navigation, then flight management, now flight controls. The pattern suggests either electromagnetic attack or sophisticated cyber attack, something targeting your electronics in a specific sequence. Military aircraft have hardening against this kind of attack. Commercial aircraft don't because the threat was considered theoretical. Apparently it's not theoretical, Mitchell said grimly. Apparently not. Sarah leaned forward to examine the primary flight display more closely. The altitude indicator was working, airspeed still showed valid data, attitude reference seemed reliable. The basic instruments that predated fly-by-wire were holding. That made sense, they were less dependent on the vulnerable network systems. You're going to lose your fly-by-wire completely within the next 3 to 5 minutes. When that happens, you'll have degraded elevator control and throttle management, but no computer-assisted coordination. Do either of you have any manual flying experience without computer assistance? Mitchell shook his head. All my experience is on modern aircraft. Fly-by-wire has been standard for 15 years. Same, Torres said quietly. Flight school was all glass cockpit. I've never hand-flown without computer augmentation. Sarah had expected this answer. Modern commercial pilots were highly trained, extraordinarily skilled at managing complex aircraft systems and following procedures. But they'd been trained in an era where computers always mediated between pilot input and aircraft response. They'd never learned the fundamental skill of feeling an aircraft through their hands, reading its behavior through tiny pressure changes on the control stick, making instinctive corrections that predated conscious thought. Carrier pilots learned this skill because landing on a carrier required it. When you were bringing a 30-ton fighter onto a 500-foot deck at night in heavy seas with the ship pitching and rolling, computers could only help so much. The final approach required manual feel, instinct built through hundreds of repetitions, the ability to read aircraft energy state through your hands and make instant corrections measured in inches of stick movement and ounces of throttle pressure. It was the most demanding flying humans ever did, and it was pure manual skill. I have that experience, Sarah said. 16 years of it. 3 carrier deployments, over 200 carrier landings including night operations in bad weather. Manual flying without computer assistance is what carrier aviation teaches better than any other form of flight training. If your fly-by-wire fails completely, I can talk you through procedures that will let you keep flying this aircraft. Mitchell looked at her with naked hope breaking through his professional composure. You can do that? You can teach us to fly without computers? I can. But you need to trust me completely and follow my instructions exactly. No arguing, no second guessing. In carrier aviation, when the landing signal officer calls a wave off, you don't debate, you firewall the throttles and go around immediately. That kind of instant response to verbal commands is what kept me alive for 16 years. It's what's going to keep all 267 people on this aircraft alive today. The aircraft shuddered, a vibration that shouldn't have existed on the smooth-riding 787. Torres gasped. Flight control anomaly. I'm getting uncommanded roll inputs. That's the fly-by-wire dying, Sarah said calmly. The computers are fighting each other for control. Don't fight against it, make small, smooth corrections. Feel what the aircraft wants to do and guide it gently. You're not commanding the aircraft anymore, you're suggesting directions and working with it. Mitchell was gripping the control stick so hard his knuckles were white. This feels completely wrong. Like the aircraft is alive and angry. It is alive in a sense, Sarah said. All aircraft are. They have personalities, preferences, behaviors. Computers mask that by making everything feel uniform and predictable. But underneath, the 787 is a physical object moving through physical air, subject to aerodynamics and physics. When the computers stop compensating, you feel the real aircraft. That's what you're feeling now, the honest machine without artificial smoothness. Torres was working through degraded displays. We've lost our navigation completely. I have no idea where we are. You're over the mid-Atlantic, Sarah said. Approximately 1,200 nautical miles from either continent based on time since departure and ground speed. The sun position indicates we're tracking southwest, which is roughly correct for the Great Circle route to Boston. We're going to navigate visually using time estimation and sun position. It's not precise but it'll get us to the North American coast. Visual navigation. Mitchell looked at her like she'd suggested using an astrolabe. We're at 25,000 feet over the ocean. Pilots did it for decades before GPS, Sarah replied. During World War II, bombers crossed the Atlantic using dead reckoning and celestial navigation. We have better tools than they did, we have accurate timepieces and we know our departure point and rough direction. I can estimate our position well enough to find landfall. The aircraft shuddered again, more violently this time. Multiple warning tones sounded simultaneously. Torres's voice rose with panic, flight control system failure. Primary and secondary. Sarah put her hand on Torres's shoulder, squeezing firmly. Breathe. Focus. This is the failure we've been expecting. The fly-by-wire is gone. You're flying manually now with basic elevator and throttle. Captain Mitchell, how do the controls feel? Mitchell moved the stick experimentally. The response was mushy, delayed, wrong. Like flying through mud. I move the stick and nothing happens for a second, then the aircraft responds too much. That's normal for degraded manual flight, Sarah said. The 787 was never designed to fly without computers, so the control feel is terrible. But it's still flyable if you know what you're doing. Let me talk you through it. First, establish a level attitude on your primary flight display, horizon line between the wings on your attitude indicator. Don't look outside, just fly the instruments. Mitchell made a stick input. The nose dropped too far, then came back up too high, oscillating. I can't stabilize it. Stop making large inputs, Sarah commanded. Tiny movements. Millimeters. Feel the stick pressure in your hand, that's telling you what the aircraft is doing. When you feel pressure increasing, that means the nose is rising. When pressure decreases, the nose is falling. Use that tactile feedback, not your eyes. This is how we land on carriers in zero visibility, by feel. Mitchell tried again with smaller inputs. The oscillations dampened. Okay. That's better. But I'm constantly correcting. You will be, Sarah said. Manual flight means constant tiny corrections. Your hands never stop moving. On a carrier approach, I make 200 to 300 small stick corrections in the final 30 seconds before touchdown. That's what manual flying requires, constant active control. Torres was monitoring airspeed and altitude. We're holding 250 knots, level at flight level 250. But without navigation, without communication, without weather radar, how do we land this thing? We don't even know where the nearest airport is. We're going to continue on rough heading toward the North American coast, Sarah said. We'll reach landfall in approximately 2 hours based on my position estimate. When we see land, we'll identify our location visually and find the nearest suitable airport. Without communication, we'll declare emergency through transponder and approach pattern. Without weather radar, we'll assess conditions visually. And without fly-by-wire, we'll land using carrier approach procedures adapted for runway touchdown. Carrier procedures? Mitchell's voice cracked. I'm not a military pilot. I don't know carrier procedures. You're going to learn them in the next 2 hours, Sarah said firmly. Because they're the only procedures developed for this exact scenario, landing a high-performance aircraft manually without computer assistance. Carrier pilots have been doing it since 1922. You're going to do it today. The cockpit fell into tense silence as Mitchell fought the degraded controls and Torres monitored their crippled systems. Sarah stood between them, her eyes moving constantly between instruments, outside views, and the pilot's body language. She was back in her element for the first time in 2 years, not flying herself but directing flight, commanding a critical operation, using 16 years of expertise to solve an impossible problem. But underneath her calm exterior, her mind was screaming. This scenario was too similar to her final carrier landing, struggling with compromised controls, feeling the aircraft fighting her inputs, knowing that one mistake would kill people she was responsible for protecting. She could see Marcus's face, hear his voice in her headset during their last flight. Hawk, this approach doesn't feel right. Request wave off. She'd heard the concern in his voice but she'd been committed to the landing, convinced she could salvage it. She'd been wrong. And he'd died because of her decision. No. She forced the memory away, compartmentalizing it with the mental discipline that had allowed her to function after the crash. This wasn't that flight. These pilots weren't Marcus. She had the knowledge to save them if she stayed focused and didn't let trauma override competence. Captain Mitchell, she said, her voice steady and calm. How's the aircraft handling now? Still terrible, but I'm getting a feel for it. The controls are mushy and delayed but I'm learning the timing. Good. That's exactly what manual flying is, learning your specific aircraft's personality and timing. Every aircraft is slightly different. Keep practicing smooth inputs while we have altitude and time. You need to build muscle memory. Torres was studying the fuel display. We have enough fuel to reach the coast with reasonable reserve. But without navigation systems, I can't calculate exact fuel required. We're conservative on fuel, Sarah said. At our current speed and altitude, fuel burn is approximately 3,000 kilograms per hour. We have maybe 35,000 kilograms remaining, which gives us about 11 hours of flight. More than enough to reach land and find an airport. How do you know that? Torres asked. I memorized the 787's fuel consumption profiles when I was studying civilian aircraft systems, Sarah said. Fighter pilots obsess about fuel. We fly aircraft with combat radius measured in hundreds of miles, and running out of gas over water means ejection and possibly death. I know fuel calculations for every aircraft I've studied. Mitchell managed a tight smile. Glad you're obsessive about fuel. It saved my life multiple times. Sarah checked the angle of sunlight coming through the cockpit windows. Based on sun position, we're tracking west-southwest. That's going to bring us to Newfoundland or Nova Scotia rather than Boston, but that's fine. We just need any runway long enough for a 787. The next 90 minutes passed in tense concentration. Mitchell hand flew the crippled aircraft while Sarah coached him through the feel of manual control, how to read energy state through stick pressure, how to coordinate pitch and power without computer assistance, how to make smooth corrections that didn't oscillate. Torres monitored systems, occasionally reporting more failures as the electronic attack continued degrading aircraft systems, but the basic flight instruments held steady. Sarah taught them carrier aviation fundamentals, energy management using the relationship between airspeed and altitude, visual navigation using time and heading, preparation for manual approach and landing using procedures developed for the most demanding aviation scenario humans had ever created. The commercial pilots learned quickly, their professional competence translating to this unfamiliar domain under her expert instruction. But as they continued westward over the featureless Atlantic, Sarah felt the past closing in on her. She was teaching the exact procedures she'd been executing when Marcus died, manual approach with degraded controls, fighting an aircraft that didn't want to respond correctly, making split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. Every instruction she gave the pilots echoed conversations she'd had with Marcus, every system failure paralleled that final flight, every passing minute brought her closer to confronting the skills she'd abandoned after the crash. She'd told herself for 2 years that she was done with aviation, that civilian life meant putting carrier operations behind her permanently. But here she was, back in a cockpit under emergency conditions, using precisely the expertise she'd tried to retire. The universe had a dark sense of humor. Land. Torres suddenly pointed ahead. I see land. Sarah leaned forward to look through the windscreen. A coastline was emerging from the haze ahead, rugged, rocky, clearly North Atlantic rather than the more developed American coast they'd expected to reach first. That's Newfoundland. Eastern Canada. We made good progress. Mitchell breathed out in relief. Okay. Where do we land? We need to identify a suitable airport, Sarah said. We need at least 8,000 feet of runway for a 787, preferably 10,000 given that we'll be landing manually with degraded controls. Torres, do you remember any airports in Newfoundland that meet those requirements? Torres thought for a moment. St. John's International. It's the capital city, Eastern Coast. Should have runways long enough. Good. We navigate toward the eastern coast of Newfoundland, find St. John's, and make our approach. Sarah paused, choosing her next words carefully. But I need to prepare you both for what's coming. Landing a 787 manually with degraded controls is going to be the hardest flying either of you have ever done. Without computer assistance, you're going to feel every gust of wind, every speed variation, every shift in aircraft energy state. The landing itself will be imprecise by commercial standards, rough, possibly hard enough to require aircraft inspection afterward. But by carrier standards, it'll be perfect, because carrier standards say any landing you walk away from is a success. Mitchell glanced back at her. Are you saying we might damage the aircraft? I'm saying you might bounce, you might land harder than normal, you might use more runway than standard. But you won't crash. Not if you follow my instructions exactly. She met his eyes with absolute certainty. Captain Mitchell, First Officer Torres, I'm going to tell you something now, and I need you to believe it completely. I'm landing this plane. Not you, me. I'm going to talk you through every input, every correction, every adjustment from initial approach through touchdown. You're going to trust my voice and do exactly what I say without hesitation or doubt. And we're going to put this aircraft on the ground safely using nothing but manual skill and carrier aviation precision that's been perfected over a century of landing on moving ships. Her voice carried such command authority that both pilots felt their fear diminish for the first time since systems started failing. This wasn't a passenger making hopeful suggestions. This was a combat veteran with absolute confidence in her ability to accomplish the mission. Okay, Commander, Mitchell said quietly. You've been right about everything so far. You've gotten us this far alive. What do we do? Sarah allowed herself a small smile. We're going to learn to land on a boat. Except the boat is a runway and it's not moving, which makes it much easier. As they approached Newfoundland's coastline, Sarah directed them lower and slower, establishing parameters for visual approach to St. John's. The city was clearly visible on the eastern shore, buildings, roads, and most importantly, an airport with long runways extending toward the ocean. Without communication, they couldn't coordinate with air traffic control, but the emergency transponder code would have alerted controllers to clear airspace and prepare emergency services. Descend to 3,000 feet, Sarah instructed. Speed 200 knots. We're going to enter a standard visual pattern, identify the runway, and set up for approach. Mitchell descended carefully, the aircraft responding sluggishly to his inputs. At 3,000 feet, they could see St. John's International clearly, 2 runways in an approximate cross pattern, emergency vehicles already positioning near the longest runway. Runway 11, approximately 7,500 feet, Torres said, reading the markings. Winds look light, we can see flags near the terminal barely moving. Good conditions, Sarah said. We'll enter left traffic for runway 11, fly a standard carrier brake, continuous descending turn onto final approach. No time to set up a long, stabilized approach. We're going to do this the way we land on carriers, descending turn directly to landing. That's not standard procedure, Mitchell protested weakly. Standard procedure requires systems we don't have, Sarah replied. Carrier brake is designed for visual approach without navigation aids, which is exactly our situation. Trust the process. She positioned herself directly behind Mitchell's seat, close enough to see his control inputs and speak directly into his ear. All right, Captain, this is where carrier aviation happens. I'm going to call the brake, the groove, and the ball. Those are carrier terms. Brake means we start our descending turn. Groove means we're established on glide path. Ball means we're committed to landing. From brake to touchdown is typically 45 to 60 seconds. You're going to listen to my voice and respond instantly to every command. Mitchell's hands were shaking slightly on the controls. Sarah put her hand on his shoulder. Breathe. Focus. You've got this. You're a skilled pilot with thousands of hours. I'm just giving you the tools to fly manually. Your hands know what to do, trust them. Okay. I'm ready. Approaching the brake point, Sarah said, watching their position relative to the runway. When I call brake, you're going to bank 45 degrees left and start descending at 300 feet per minute. Keep your speed at 180 knots. Smooth, continuous turn, no hesitation. They flew parallel to the runway at 3,000 feet. Sarah watched the geometry, calculating the perfect moment. 3, 2, 1. Brake. Mitchell rolled left into the turn, the aircraft banking steeply. The 787 descended in a continuous arc, the runway sweeping into view through the left windows as they spiraled downward. Sarah's voice was constant in his ear, hold that bank angle. Watch your speed, 180 knots. Descent rate 300 feet per minute. Small throttle corrections. You're doing great. Keep the turn smooth and continuous. Torres called altitudes, 2,500 feet. 2,000 feet. 1,500 feet. Rolling out now, Sarah commanded. Wings level, align with runway centerline. Mitchell rolled right, bringing the wings level. The runway was ahead, but their alignment was off, they were right of centerline and too high on glide path. Correct left, ease left, Sarah said calmly. Small bank angle, 10 degrees. You're high on glide path, reduce power slightly, let the nose drop. Feel the aircraft settling into the groove. Mitchell made the corrections, his hands responding to her voice. The aircraft drifted left toward centerline, the nose dropped slightly, and suddenly they were aligned with the runway in a shallow descent. That's the groove, Sarah said, her voice taking on a different quality, the precise, measured tone of a landing signal officer talking a pilot aboard. You're in the groove. This is where we land. From here to touchdown, you make constant tiny corrections. Airspeed 160 knots. Glide path steady. Small power adjustments for altitude, tiny stick inputs for alignment. Your hands never stop moving. The runway was growing larger in the windscreen, the threshold approaching at 160 knots, approximately 270 feet per second. They were less than a mile out, maybe 30 seconds from touchdown. Sarah's voice became a continuous stream of commands: little power, back on centerline, perfect glide path, small correction right, ease the nose down, maintain speed, you're looking good. Mitchell's hands were moving constantly on the stick and throttles, making the dozens of micro-corrections that manual flying required. The runway threshold passed beneath them. They were over the numbers, descending through 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. Ease back on the stick, Sarah commanded. Gentle flare. Let the aircraft settle. Power to idle. Hold the nose up. Hold it, hold it. The main landing gear touched down with a firm thump that was rougher than any commercial landing but perfectly acceptable by carrier standards. The aircraft bounced once, about 3 feet, then settled back onto the runway. Mitchell immediately deployed thrust reversers and stood on the brakes. The 787 decelerated rapidly, slowing through 100 knots, 80 knots, 60 knots, finally coming to a stop with about 2,000 feet of runway remaining. For 3 seconds, the cockpit was absolutely silent except for the wind-down whine of the engines. Then Mitchell started laughing, not hysteria but pure relief, the uncontrolled reaction to surviving impossible stress. Torres was crying quietly, her hands shaking. Sarah closed her eyes and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 2 years. "We're down," Mitchell said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're actually down. All 267 people alive." Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft immediately, but there was no fire, no smoke, no crisis except the crisis they'd just survived. Mitchell shut down the engines and Torres began the emergency evacuation checklist, but Sarah knew they wouldn't need to evacuate. The landing had been rough but safe. The aircraft was intact. She stepped back from the pilot's seats, her legs suddenly weak as adrenaline drained away. Through the cockpit windows, she could see passengers in the cabin, confused, frightened, but alive. All of them alive because carrier aviation procedures had translated to commercial aviation, because skills developed for landing on ships had saved a crippled airliner, because a retired naval aviator had walked into a cockpit and remembered who she used to be. Captain Mitchell turned in his seat to look at her. "Commander Brennan, you just saved 267 lives. I don't know how to thank you." Sarah shook her head. "You saved them. You flew this aircraft. I just provided the instructions." "Instructions that we couldn't have survived without," Torres added. "I've never experienced anything like that. The way you talked us through every moment of that landing, it felt like you were flying through us." "That's what carrier LSOs do," Sarah said quietly. "They put pilots aboard when conditions make it nearly impossible. They use their voice and their experience to guide aircraft to deck when darkness or weather or system failures would otherwise kill pilots. I've listened to LSOs for 16 years. Today I got to be one." Mitchell keyed the cabin intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We've landed safely in St. John's, Newfoundland. We experienced serious technical problems during the flight, but through the extraordinary assistance of a passenger with military aviation experience, we were able to land without injury to anyone aboard. Emergency services are responding as a precaution, but there is no danger. You'll be deplaning normally once we're cleared by local authorities. On behalf of First Officer Torres and myself, thank you for your cooperation during this emergency." He released the intercom and looked at Sarah. "What's going to happen now?" "Investigators will want to talk to all of us," Sarah said. "Whatever caused your systems to fail, cyber attack, electromagnetic interference, some other cause, they'll need to understand it to prevent it from happening to other aircraft. You'll both be extensively debriefed. And you'll probably be famous for successfully landing a crippled 787 using manual carrier procedures. We didn't do anything, Mitchell protested. You did everything. I provided knowledge. You provided skill and courage. Both were necessary. Sarah moved toward the cockpit door. I should get back to my seat. Let you handle the official response. Torres stood and impulsively hugged her. Thank you doesn't feel adequate. You saved my life. You saved everyone. Sarah returned the hug briefly, then gently disengaged. You're welcome. You both did excellent work under impossible pressure. Any carrier pilot would be proud of how you flew. She left the cockpit and walked back through the cabin, where passengers were beginning to realize something extraordinary had happened. The flight attendants were trying to maintain order, but excited conversations were breaking out everywhere. The young couple from 23B and 23C stared at her as she passed. Were you in the cockpit? The young woman asked. Did you help land the plane? The pilots landed the plane, Sarah said simply. I just assisted. She slid into her window seat in 23A and looked out at the emergency vehicles and the Newfoundland landscape beyond. 2 years ago, she told herself she was done with carrier aviation, done with the identity that had defined her adult life. But today she returned to those skills, used that expertise, saved lives using procedures she'd learned aboard carriers. The universe had given her an impossible scenario that only her specific training could solve. Marcus would have laughed at the irony. Hawk, he would have said, you can't escape who you are. Naval aviator is what you were born to be. Maybe he was right. Maybe the crash hadn't ended her career but merely changed its form. Maybe walking away from the deck didn't mean walking away from aviation, it meant finding new ways to use 16 years of the most demanding flight training humans ever developed. She pulled out her phone as airport personnel began boarding the aircraft. She had a message to send, to the Navy, to the training command, to someone who could translate what had just happened into something valuable. If a retired carrier pilot could save a commercial airliner by applying carrier procedures, then maybe those procedures needed to be taught more widely. Maybe commercial pilots needed carrier aviation training for scenarios where computers failed and only manual skill could save them. Her therapist had said she needed to forgive herself and find meaning after trauma. Maybe this was the meaning, not returning to the cockpit as a pilot but teaching what she knew, sharing expertise that could save lives, transforming carrier aviation from military technique to universal aviation skill. Underscore 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 underscore. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in a conference room at American Airlines training facility in Fort Worth, Texas, facing 50 senior captains and training officers who'd come to hear about Flight 209. The incident had made international news, the mysterious system's failure over the Atlantic, the manual landing using military procedures, the passenger who'd saved 267 lives. Investigators had confirmed cyber attack as the cause. Sophisticated malware planted in aircraft systems during maintenance, designed to destroy flight computers at a specific time over the middle of the ocean where help was impossible. It had been targeted assassination disguised as aircraft failure, stopped only because a retired naval aviator happened to be aboard. The investigation was ongoing, but aviation authorities worldwide were already implementing new cybersecurity protocols and updating training requirements. And the Navy had asked Sarah to help develop manual flying curricula based on carrier procedures, teaching commercial pilots the skills that carrier aviators had perfected over a century of landing on ships. What Commander Brennan demonstrated on Flight 209, the training director said, introducing her, was that carrier aviation procedures represent the most advanced manual flying techniques ever developed. When modern aircraft fail catastrophically and computers stop working, carrier skills become the difference between survival and fatal accident. We've invited her here to discuss how we can incorporate these techniques into commercial pilot training. Sarah stepped forward, feeling 50 pairs of skeptical eyes evaluating her. Commercial pilots were proud of their profession, and rightly so. They were extraordinarily skilled at managing complex aircraft systems. But most had never hand-flown without computer assistance, never learned the instinctive manual skills that carrier aviation required. "Thank you for having me," she began. 3 weeks ago, I was a retired naval officer trying to leave aviation behind. Today I'm standing here because an aircraft I was riding experienced total systems failure, and 2 commercial pilots had to learn carrier landing procedures in 90 minutes or everyone aboard would have died. What I want to talk about today isn't criticism of commercial aviation, it's recognition that carrier procedures fill a gap in training that we didn't know existed until computers started failing in ways nobody predicted. She advanced to the first slide, a photograph of an F/A-18 Super Hornet approaching a carrier at night. This is what carrier aviation looks like. You're bringing a 30-ton aircraft onto a 500-foot deck that's moving in 3 dimensions, pitching, rolling, and heaving in whatever sea state happens to exist. You're doing it at night, often in bad weather, with minimal visual references and closure rates of 150 knots. Computer assistance can only help so much because the carrier's movement is unpredictable. The final approach requires pure manual skill, feeling the aircraft through your hands, making constant corrections measured in inches of stick movement, trusting instinct developed through hundreds of repetitions. She clicked to the next slide, statistics comparing carrier aviation to commercial aviation. Carrier pilots make about 200 landings per year. Commercial pilots make maybe 500. But carrier landings are exponentially more difficult. They require precision within 1 foot of altitude and 5 feet of position in conditions where commercial aviation would declare minimum equipment violations and cancel flights. This develops manual flying skill that has no equivalent in commercial aviation. A captain in the front row raised his hand. "Commander Brennan, with respect, commercial aviation focuses on safety through systems redundancy and procedure, not manual flying skill. Our aircraft have backup systems specifically so pilots don't need to hand fly in emergencies." "I agree completely," Sarah said. "And that philosophy has made commercial aviation incredibly safe. But Flight 209 proved that backups can fail. Redundant systems can be compromised. And when that happens, only manual flying skill saves the aircraft. What I'm proposing isn't replacing your current training. It's adding carrier techniques as emergency procedures for scenarios where systems fail completely." She spent the next 2 hours walking through specific techniques: energy management without computer assistance, visual approach procedures without navigation aids, manual landing using carrier ball call methodology, and the mental techniques carrier pilots use to maintain composure during high-stress operations. Some pilots were skeptical, others intrigued, but all recognized that Flight 209 had exposed a genuine gap in training. At the end of the presentation, the training director approached her. "Commander Brennan, American Airlines would like to offer you a consulting position developing manual flying training based on carrier procedures. We're also coordinating with the FAA to incorporate these techniques into simulator training for all commercial pilots. Would you be interested?" Sarah looked at him, considering the question seriously. 3 weeks ago she would have refused immediately. Anything involving aviation was something she'd left behind. But 3 weeks ago she'd also believed she was done with carrier procedures, and instead she'd used them to save 267 lives. Maybe running from her past wasn't healing. Maybe engaging with it, transforming it into something that honored Marcus's memory and saved lives, was the actual path forward. "I'm interested," she said. "But I have one condition. This training program includes discussion of the psychological aspects of emergency flying, how to manage fear, how to make decisions under extreme stress, how to recover from aviation trauma. Carrier pilots deal with this constantly because carrier operations are inherently traumatic. Commercial pilots need these skills too." "Agreed," the director said. "When can you start?" 6 months later, Sarah stood on the deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford during a training exercise, watching F divided by a -18s make their approaches in daylight and calm seas. She was consulting for the Navy now in addition to her work with American Airlines, helping develop training that bridged military and commercial aviation. The Ford's Air boss had invited her aboard to observe current carrier operations and discuss how procedures had evolved since her retirement. She watched a Super Hornet establish the groove, the LSO's voice steady in her ear through the monitor headset. "You're high and right, power back, line up, call the ball." "Hornet ball, 3.5, the pilot responded, confirming visual contact with the landing reference system and fuel state. "Roger ball," the LSO replied, taking control of the approach. Sarah watched the aircraft descend toward the angled deck, making constant small corrections in response to LSO calls and wind conditions. The hook caught the 3-wire perfectly, a textbook carrier landing that made it look easy even though she knew from 16 years of experience that nothing about carrier aviation was ever easy. The air boss smiled at her. "Miss it, Commander?" Sarah considered the question honestly. "Parts of it. The precision. The challenge. The community of people who understand why this matters." She gestured at the recovered aircraft. "But I don't miss the fear anymore. And I've found ways to use what I learned here in contexts that save lives without the constant edge of danger." "We heard about Flight 209, the air boss said. "The whole fleet's been talking about it. Retired carrier pilot saves commercial airliner using procedures we developed. That's good publicity for naval aviation." "It's more than publicity," Sarah replied. "It proved that carrier aviation represents expertise that translates beyond military operations. Every time a commercial pilot learns carrier procedures, they're learning skills that could save hundreds of lives someday. That feels meaningful." Another Super Hornet entered the groove. Sarah watched automatically, her trained eye evaluating the approach. Slightly low on glide slope, the LSO called power, the pilot added throttle smoothly, the aircraft settled into the perfect glide path and trapped the 3-wire. Flawless execution of procedures she'd practiced thousands of times. "You know what Marcus would say if he could see what you're doing now," the air boss said quietly. He'd known her and Marcus during their squadron days, had attended the memorial service after the crash. Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar ache of grief that had softened over time. He'd say, "Hawk, took you long enough to figure out what you're supposed to be doing. He always understood things faster than I did." He'd also say he's proud of you. Using the skills you both developed to save lives in new contexts, that honors his memory better than walking away from aviation entirely. Maybe. Sarah watched another approach, another perfect carrier landing, the continuous cycle of aircraft launching and recovering that defined carrier operations. "I'm starting to believe that healing doesn't mean forgetting or avoiding. It means integrating trauma into something constructive, something that creates meaning from loss." Teaching carrier procedures to commercial pilots creates meaning from Marcus's death, his expertise, his training. What we learn together saves lives in ways neither of us anticipated. The air boss nodded. "That sounds like healing to me." That evening, Sarah stood on the deck watching sunset over the Atlantic. The carrier was steaming southwest, operating approximately 150 miles off the Virginia coast where the ocean stretched to every horizon. She'd stood on carriers dozens of times watching similar sunsets during deployments, the strange combination of beauty and isolation that defined life aboard ship. Her phone vibrated with a message from Captain Mitchell. "First simulator session with your carrier approach training today. Both Torres and I felt like we were back in flight school, humbling but valuable. Thanks again for everything. You literally saved our lives." She smiled and typed a response. "You saved your own lives by trusting the process and executing under pressure. I just provided the roadmap. Proud of you both." Another message came through, this one from her therapist, checking in. "How was the carrier visit? Are you managing okay with being back in that environment?" Sarah considered her response carefully. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined standing on a carrier deck without having a panic attack. The memories, the guilt, the trauma had been too fresh. But something had shifted after Flight 209, not that the pain disappeared or the memories healed completely, but that she'd proven to herself she could engage with carrier aviation without being destroyed by it. She typed, "I'm okay. Better than okay. Being here reminds me of what I loved about carrier aviation, not just what I lost. Watching approaches today, I felt proud of what we do rather than haunted by the crash." Progress. The therapist's response came quickly, "That's significant progress. Engaging with trauma rather than avoiding it, finding meaning rather than just coping, exactly what we've been working toward. Proud of you." Sarah pocketed her phone and looked out at the darkening ocean. Somewhere below this same ocean, Flight 209 would have crashed if not for carrier procedures applied to commercial aviation. Somewhere in this same ocean, ships had operated for over a century, launching and recovering aircraft using techniques that had now proven valuable far beyond military operations. She thought about Marcus, about the crash, about 16 years of carrier aviation and 2 years of trying to escape it. She thought about the terrifying silence in Flight 209's cockpit when both pilots realized they might not save the aircraft, and how her voice breaking that silence, "I'm landing this plane," had changed the outcome from tragedy to survival. Maybe carrier aviation had never been about her alone. Maybe it had always been about what she could teach, what she could share, how her expertise could translate to contexts she'd never imagined. Marcus had died doing what he loved, trusting her skill and judgment. Honoring his memory meant using that skill and judgment to save lives, whether from a carrier cockpit or a commercial airliner or a training facility teaching manual procedures to hundreds of pilots. She wasn't Commander Hawk Brennan anymore, legendary carrier pilot with 200 perfect landings. She was Sarah Brennan, retired officer who'd found new purpose translating military expertise to civilian applications. The identity had shifted but the essential skill remained. And maybe that was enough. A young sailor approached her on deck. "Ma'am. The captain invites you to join him for dinner in the wardroom. He wants to hear about your work with commercial aviation training." "Tell him I'd be honored," Sarah replied. She took one last look at the ocean, the sunset painting the water in shades of orange and gold, then turned and followed the sailor inside. Behind her, aircraft continued their eternal cycle, launching, recovering, launching again, the routine of carrier operations that would continue long after her participation ended. But now she understood that her participation hadn't ended. It had just transformed into something new, something that honored what she'd learned while creating space for who she was becoming. Carrier aviator. Instructor. Survivor. Teacher. All of these identities coexisting, integrated, creating meaning from trauma and purpose from loss. The cockpit had gone silent over the Atlantic. A woman's voice had broken that silence with absolute authority and saved 267 lives. And in doing so, she'd saved herself.